Hi, I'm Bhavna Shah, Vice President of Indian Vegetable Oil Producers Association, known as IVPA, a premier apex body representing Indian veg oils industry. And today, I will be diving into oilseeds, veg oil, and trade strategy outlook 2026-27. India's GDP, India's economic trajectory growth remains resilient at or maybe in between 6.5 to 7.4%, driven mainly by domestic consumption and investment. But let me tell you, this forecast was prepared sometime end of last year, early beginning of this year. So basically, I'm trying to say much before the US Iran Israel conflict erupted. But coming back to the Indian economy, we definitely do see resilience, and it will be somewhere in the range between the two, 6.5 to 7.4. But it does face downside risk, and downside risk mainly coming from high crude prices and a weaker monsoon impacting inflation and rural demand. Now, we are looking at India's veg oil sector in a polycrisis environment by where climate shocks, geopolitical tensions, and energy markets are all interacting. Now, for 2026-27, three forces stand out. Number one, weak monsoons. Like I mentioned earlier, the Indian Meteorological Department has forecasted a weak monsoon. Second is crude holding nearly about $95 a barrel due to geopolitical risk and strong global biofuel demand tightening edible oil availability. So we are moving from a stable deficit to a more volatile, shock sensitive system. Now, what do I mean by stable deficit to a volatile or shock sensitive system? See, it's a well known fact that India is a big importer of veg oils. It has not been able to meet its domestic requirement and therefore relies heavily on imports. But those factors are more or less stable. This time we are seeing very new fundamentals, which is causing a lot of volatility and shock sensitive system. Now, forget all of that. The main question is, can India manage inflation or it risks being drawn into a broader inflationary spiral? Now, if you ask me, in short term, yes, through smart imports and buffer management. One thing to note over here is globally, biofuel economics are strong. You see US mandates, Indonesia's positive biodiesel margins thanks to the POGO spread, Thailand's ethanol trend set to continue, ASEAN blending. Even now, if you see, Malaysia has made a recent announcement of increasing their biofuel mandate and joining the bandwagon. So, all of this is keeping supply tight. So, that brings us to the structural reality. What is the core imbalance here? So, when we talk about structural reality, let's start from the India's consumption, which stands at about 25, 26 million metric tons, with domestic availability covering only about 40 to 45%, leaving us with a gap which has become more or less permanent, about 55 to 60% import dependence, and thereby high exposure to global vegetable oil prices, energy markets, and currency movements. So, weak monsoons is actually triggering the domestic shock. Then we have India's fertilizer issue, which is again driven by the geopolitical disruptions, raising import cost, then gas linked production constraints and structural overdependence on urea, leading to price pressure and localized supply tightness despite adequate overall stocks. Uh, Crude oil volatility from US Iran tensions, and Black Sea issues directly drives edible oil inflation. And if you ask me, buyers are stepping back, but obviously, and betting that the war driven rally will ease, limiting the CPI, the consumer price index, pass through to just about 2 to 3%. Now, biofuel mandates are structurally tightening global palm oil supply demand imbalance. Now, if you see all these producing, exporting countries are tightening their supplies, yet India remains a prime destination for any surpluses. India is seen as a sink that will absorb any kind of surplus wherever in the world it exists. Like China's soybean oil arriving for the first time in decades at about 40 to 50,000 tons per month. Now, its sustainability that looks reasonable via the new trade quotas. That brings us to domestic edible oil production. Now, domestic production remains structurally constrained. It's flat at about 9 to 9.6 million metric tons through 25-26. Now, soybean oil dips to 1.6 million tons as corn production cuts into soybean acreage by 12%. Rapeseed is holding for rapeseed holds around 3.5 million tons and others stay stable. Oil palm mission promises 1.2 million tons by 2030 in a best case scenario, with yields comparable to Malaysia, Indonesia. Now, if you see states in Andhra, the southern belt, Andhra, Telangana, they have been showing good progress, but Northeast has been a little slow. Then corn demand is booming. Now, with 46% of the ethanol program alongside rice and balancing the 50% sugar molasses basil and corn DDGS. So, corn DDGS competes now directly with soybean meal, making the MSP, the minimum support price, difficult to uphold. Recently, the Indo-US agreement allowed about 500,000 tons of corn DDGS, now adding supply pressure to the oilseed sector. Now, all this we are talking from the oilseed sector perspective, but this is providing a real boost to the feed sector. Now, this brings us to a very interesting is creates a food versus feed versus fuel competition where maize and DDGS are directly competing with oilseed economics. So it's all circular and complex from policy perspective. Policy is becoming increasingly interlinked across commodities and not siloed. Turning to imports, they have been range bound at about 15 to 17 million metric tons, with March 2026 up 11% year on year to 1.19 million tons. Though, if you see the 2 month average dipped 12%, very clearly it was due to high prices capping the demand. Now, per capita consumption growth has normalized. I'm talking about the pandemic time. I think it's all that is history from that sub 2% levels. We are back to the normal per capita consumption growth. Stability here is driven by supply factors rather than surging demand. Now, this is again something very interesting to note. Now, while we are talking about import trends, veg oil import trends, let me draw you this. This is India's agri paradox and demand pressure. You see, India has a very strong base. Despite low yields, India is among the largest producers of wheat, rice, dairy, sugar, fruits, and vegetables. So largely it's surplus. And mind you, this surplus is after feeding 1.4 billion people. But deficits are concentrated in pulses and edible oils. Now, if you talk about demand, this is something again very interesting to note. As GDP grows, so does consumption and purchasing power. But the scale effect is very critical. At only 1 kg per capita increase, that would mean 1.4 million tons of additional demand. So even small demand shifts create disproportionate supply pressure. The issue is oilseed production has not been able to keep pace, and so the gap is widening and imports remain the balancing factor here. We spoke about imports, and now let's look at the import composition and the trend. Now, India's veg oil import composition is shifting from price optimized sourcing to supply driven procurement. Now, post April 2026, soybean and palm will compete for India's share. Uh, with China, soybean oil making a notable entry. Sunflower oil will show demand resilience as you know, sunflower oil has its own customer base, especially in South India, where it commands a good household share. Maybe because of its light profile and other advantages. So it remains as sustaining its staple status in South despite supply tightening. So this evolution increases cost pressures and reduces the flexibility in managing edible oil inflation. The import basket will be palm heavy. Palm retains its cost edge for now. Oilseed output estimates show weather-led subdued growth with duty adjustments as tactical inflation moves. Now, also, if you note, even if the tensions in the US-Iran conflict they ease, demand recovery takes about 3 to 4 weeks, and supply disruptions, especially in Argentina, may delay soybean oil shipments. Palm oil shipments remain strong due to favorable price spreads, especially at Kandla. So, stability in volumes is masking underlying stress in affordability and supply chains. Now, this slide answers most of your questions. Now, India veg oil structural trade-offs. India is not choosing between self-reliance and imports. India is somewhere structurally locked into managing both simultaneously. Now, see, very often this question comes up that India speaks of self sufficiency and yet import dependence, and sometimes even imports had exceeded 70%. Now, see, it's important to note that infection made policy intervention inevitable. So the objective is pragmatic. It's not like absolute to cap and gradually. So the idea is to cap it and gradually reduce dependence. So even if India is able to bring imports below 50%, it would be significant structural achievement. Government of India has launched a national mission on edible oils and national mission on oil palm. So India is committing roughly about USD 2.5 billion combined. I think it's about 1.3 billion dollars for oil palm mission and additional 1.2 for oil seeds mission. This is signaling a serious capital backed push towards edible oil self reliance. With palm, India is looking for scale, and for an oilseeds mission is looking for diversification. So India is trying to manage and achieve both. So it is caught between imports and domestic production. Talking about monsoon, monsoon remains the single largest swing factor. The policy intent cannot override agroclimatic limits on acreage expansion. Then talking about minimum support price. MSP increases signal intent, not shift. Farmer economics still favor competing crops over oilseeds. Then talking about external shocks like the US trade, DDGS flows, these are all marginal as of now, not market defining or domestic fund because domestic fundamentals still dominate. Inflation and currency. Now, these are areas that one has to be cautious and watch for. Inflation and currency are silent drivers, keeping imports viable while constraining policy flexibility. Now, if you see corn is no longer just a crop. It is contested resource between feed and fuel, tightening the overall agri balance. Government is increasingly acting as a market balancer. MSP procurement of mustard and soybean is a price support. Now, again, this is not a structural reform. The import basket reflects economic reality. Palm oil continues to dominate on affordability despite diversification intent. Now, biodiesel for India tells a very cautionary story. Um, See, a single policy misalignment. India also has its own biodiesel policy, biofuel policy. So, biodiesel here story is that policy triggered momentum without ecosystem alignment has left roughly about 4.5 billion liters capacity largely stranded and inactive. And one more thing, India's lack of having domestic exchange for a hedging mechanism is also one big challenge. Uh, so these are some of the structural trade-offs. So India's veg oil market is at a critical inflection point, moving from pure demand anchor to policy-driven shaper. Tightness will remain, but its nature evolves. India remains the largest structural demand hub, dictating global flows despite persistent import dependence where consumption outpaces productivity. See, now being a biggest importer also has its own advantages. Um, Price policy sensitivity makes us a very key driver of volatility. The strategic pivot accelerates through national missions, like I mentioned, national mission on oil palm, national mission on oil seed, backed by incentives, MSP enhancement, self-reliance push. So yet, despite all these efforts, the reality shows medium-term tightness persists. Now, if you look at war data points, what has happened is gas shortages affecting large FMCG companies, then manufacturing, then directly hitting sugar and oil consumption, grains too. If you see pet prices, the packaging material have also gone up. So these are some challenges that India is facing. The fertilizer shortages, this that could impact the Kharif season, but stocks position as well. And I think government is also watching. The Indian government is also watching with great caution and ready to intervene as and when necessary. So the evolution signals sustained tightness, but with a maturing policy outlay that will dictate import patterns and price trajectories ahead. Amid ongoing geopolitical tensions across the globe, wherever you see, I think government of India has acted very decisively, calibrating policy, securing supplies, and containing inflation, ensuring stability despite global disruptions. So, with that, what I would like to end with is we are seeing pressure on both sides. On one hand, supply is tightening due to manufacturing slowdown, supply chain issues, and agri shocks, while demand is getting hit by high prices that creates volatility. In all this, policy options are limited right now. Traditional tools aren't fully effective, and inflation and slowdown come together. But importantly, the story is only about West Asia and potential supply disturbances, coupled with extremely volatile situation in energy supply and price and speculation around it. So the overall bias remains slightly bullish. India continues to stay stable, supported by efficient supply chain by the industry, smart imports, and policy interventions as and when needed. So I'd like to just end by saying that having weathered the COVID pandemic, hopefully this too shall pass. I would be happy to take any questions, or you can write in to us at info@ivpa.in. Thank you.